Welcome to Early Evidence, a podcast exploring what we know, what we are learning, and what is still uncertain as policy and practice evolve. In today's episode, the first of a two-part series, we are focusing on mental health and psychosocial support in crisis context. We'll pay particular attention to experiences of local and national organizations who are working on the front lines of humanitarian response. We are interested in how MHPSS shows up in practice, especially for young children, often through social and emotional learning informed, community-based, and school-linked approaches. This is an early evidence conversation. We are not here to present polished models or final answers. We will try to surface what appears to be working and what isn't, and what organizations are learning as they adapt in real time. Throughout, we will treat SEL not as a separate agenda, but as one of the most common ways MHPSS is operationalized for children in crisis. To discuss this topic, we have two very experienced guests with us. Our first guest, Munira Rashid, who is a researcher and practitioner in early childhood development and mental health. She brings vast experience in implementing interventions across different contexts and emergency settings. Her work examines how measurement, context, and systems of care shape outcomes for young children. Our second guest is Grace Boutros. She is a Lebanese specialist and she comes with 10 years of experience in early childhood development and mental health and psychosocial support. She brings years of hands-on experience in designing and coordinating programs and conducting research. She is currently working at AMNA, where she designs and facilitates healing-centered training for practitioners in Middle East. She helps in strengthening play-based nurturing, trauma-informed practices in communities affected by conflict and displacement. So now we are ready to dive in. My first question is to Munira, that if she can share that what context she is working in and how MHPSS fits into your broader programming area, and what SEL-informed activities are most common in your program. Munira, over to you.
Thank you, Jamila, and thank you for being part of this conversation. My work spans Pakistan, and more recently, I have worked in different contexts like Nepal, Uganda, and Rwanda, which was in Rwanda, it was a refugee population. And some of these are visible with crisis settings where conflict and displacement explicit. The work has focused on strengthening everyday interactions. For children who are very young, between birth to 3 years, this involves supporting the caregivers and co-regulation between caregivers and children through play, through shared attention, through use of toys, and through use of books. And early childhood centers, the emphasis is, of course, again on interactions and responsive interactions, but then it's teachers or preschool teachers and facilitators and the children. And this approach reflects broader evidence that interventions work through caregivers, particularly that strength and responsiveness and reduced strength. Evidence suggests that these are among the most effective in supporting early childhood development in low resource and crisis settings. Thank you.
Thank you, Munira. That was very helpful. And Grace, you are working in Middle East, a region affected by multiple crises. Will you share how your experience in your context is and how especially MHPSS fits into your broader context?
Thank you, Jamila, and thank you for having me. When we look at the broader Middle East, but also other countries in the Arab world or in the world who are suffering and dealing with war and crisis, we are not only looking at just the political and security situations. We are looking at all the multidimensional and multi-layered crises that everyone in this country, especially children and the ECD ecosystem, are being subjected to. And that means we are looking at all the economical, nutritional, educational, social, climate, and other crises that they are being subjected to. Sometimes we often forget to understand that mental health is not a separate component, but that it is a very linked component to all of these systems, to all of these multiple crises. And when we are responding, we're not only responding to the trauma and the stress and the adversities that they are being subjected to by war and displacement, but by all these other crises that are also affecting them on several layers. So our response is important to be fused with all of the system and understanding that we cannot separate mental health from education. We cannot separate mental health from politics. We cannot separate mental health from nutrition. They all come together, and our intervention needs to focus on all of them together.
Thank you, Grace. If you continue and tell us more about your experience from the field, that what particular activities are most common in your programs and what skills you prioritize, what skills children are learning through these interventions.
It's maybe important here to talk briefly about AMNA and the work that AMNA does. Our work focuses on supporting and building the capacities and building on the capacities of individuals and communities and organizations that are already embedded in the community and they are part of this community. We work with them, we work through them, and we support them by building on their capacities through our BEITNA approach. Our partners have various programs. Some of them are creating libraries and camps. Some of them are creating safe spaces. Some of them are trying to connect parents and families to green spaces. Some of them are creating kindergartens in very vulnerable areas. Some of them are trying to have mobile clinics. So their work is very diverse. And with that, their approaches, their programs, their activities are also very diverse. But what they share in common and what we're helping them do through the BEITNA approach is to focus on true co-creation, where we start with the community. We design with the community and not just for them, where the community is part of the program, of its inception, of deciding the needs, and where the community is leveraged and designs it through using existing games, existing lullabies, existing cultural practices, whether for the children or for their families and other caregivers who might be taking care of them. When we are leveraging this local identity, we are giving parents and communities the agency to be able to first find their belonging, their sense of belonging, and second, also make sure that this is sustainable, that any type of support these families and these children are being provided with does not end when we are leaving or when any donor or support system is leaving. The main activity or main approach is to have a relational model where the caregivers and children are together in the session, where this is a way of being together that is carried throughout the activities, whatever form they might take, and where there is a predictable structure that starts, for example, with these check-ins that have a circle time where everyone comes together, where free play and symbolic play are also an important part of these sessions and these activities, whether they are classroom settings, they are green spaces settings, whether they are forest school settings, or whether they are structured mental health activities. There is a predictable system, there is free play, and this play leads all the activities that are being done together. Being together also makes sure that we are able to convey and help children build different skills that can support them in their lives, not only in responding to a specific crisis, because we do believe that there is power in prevention, that the skill development should not come after a crisis. The regulation, the emotional regulation, the different coping skills, and through individual regulation starts with co-regulation. And that is why caregivers are very important. The symbolic play allows them to really have a space where they can explore safely hard themes, where they can put them in practice, and where they can also use play when words sometimes fail them, when they are not able to express or use words. And this predictability also means that there is a final circle, a checkout, where they can come back and take with it all these lessons and shared experiences they had together. So whether there are structured activities that are unique to each program and each approach of each partner, what's important is having this circle time, is having this predictable rhythmic session structure that is also backed by evidence, that allows them to really have the individual space for each unique family's needs and each unique child's needs, but also have this common space where this community comes together and heals together and practices together.
Thank you, Grace. You have raised very key critical issues while giving practical examples from your work and work of Amna. I'll come back to those issues to learn more in depth from your experience. Now I ask Munira that in your experience, especially when you design a program or do research on any intervention, what are the key skills, coping skills which children develop through these interventions? Will you share your insights that what are the main coping skills which are prioritized in these programs and how children develop these skills through the interventions?
Yeah, sure. So I think some of them Grace has already touched upon, and I work with largely the younger age group, like birth to 3 years. So we prioritize emotional regulation, but of course we understand it is something that develops through relationships rather than within the child alone. So younger children, especially in the early years, they rely heavily on their caregivers to regulate stress and emotion. And even research from conflict-affected areas reinforces that caregiving quality is the key pathway through which adversity impacts development. Interestingly, studies have also indicated that the experience of trauma by children does not have significant effect the recovery trajectory, but the trauma experienced by the family has substantial impacts on the development of children. So it's very important to have those layers when you work with children. How do you work with the family? How do you work in the community? Especially younger children and also probably older as well, because child functions and operates in a family, and how the family functions in the face of trauma affects the child. So it's about working with the child and the family in terms of developing their emotional regulations, their strengthening the relationships, responsive caregiving. How do you pick those signals? How is their warmth in the family and how they are as a unit? And of course, that also follows then predictability in the community, safety in the community. But most importantly, I think, is the safety within the relationship that the child can find, whether it's with their immediate family, their mother, or with the teachers and the larger community that they have around them. In practice, this means supporting the child that simultaneously requires the caregiver's capacity to respond in a consistent and regulated way. And while we in the space of ECDE or ECE, we think that is something that is well established, you will be surprised actually in the evidence that comes out from the kind of intervention that they implemented in crisis settings that is not consistently implemented, and caregivers are not always part of interventions for children. So I think something that Grace has also emphasized, I would also emphasize the same, that caregivers and relationships are critical when we work with children for their emotional regulation.
Thank you, Munira. That was very helpful. When we are talking about frameworks and designing of programs, SEL, MH, BSS programs, when it comes to integration into education spaces or community spaces, can you share some insights that how psychosocial approaches can be best integrated into existing educational or community spaces? Munira, if you can continue, please.
Yes, sure. So, in terms of the design or the training, so if I talk about how it is delivered or what trainings are required, so frontline workers, including the community workers, if then there's from the same community, it's found that it's more effective to deliver their support. I have found is that emotional regulation or SEL is more than just a skill. It's an experience or the feeling of being safe. I strongly believe that you cannot train someone for essentially what it's an experience. You have to live it. So one of the clearest lessons from my work is that training alone is insufficient. So when you design programs on structured curricula and they have to deliver a specialist, whether it's like responsive caregiving program, which has been informed by the nurturing care framework, which is coaching mothers to how to interact with their child and you use play as a medium to teach them how to observe, how to be sensitive, and similarly do that with teachers in terms of what a responsive interaction will look like or what's play-based learning. But I think what remains, I wouldn't say unaddressed, but not as emphasized, is the relational capacity of those providers themselves, those facilitators or those teachers. And therefore, now we have started prioritizing ongoing mentoring and effective support for those providers themselves, because you need to experience what supportive, regulated relationships look like within those systems they're part of. So this becomes especially important in low resource settings, in crisis settings, where non-specialist delivery is common. Relational quality can vary, and some of those who are coming from these settings, they also need such support. So when you design these programs, it has to be, of course, it has to be fun, it has to be hands-on activities, but the relational experience of those providers and having a system where they can also feel safe, I think is also an important part of the design of your program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grace. Now, Munira has touched upon the relationships across the different layers of people around a child. So, when you are working in the field, who delivers this support to the children and what training is required? Like what training you are designing for the service providers or the people or facilitators or teachers who are working directly with children? So if you can share your experience, please.
I think Munira mentioned very important points, including connection and relationships. And even though these trainings and in our classic, or rather the classic system that is already existing, the trainings are usually delivered by either social workers, psychologists, facilitators. A very important key that Munira also highlighted, but I want to double down on, is identity. That there is a type of experience that you cannot teach, you cannot train. Our training does take the evidence, the science, and tries to translate it that when we talk about trauma, what does it mean? How does it show up? But what's more important is how can we be trauma informed? How can we know that trauma looks like this, that this is the science behind trauma, that stress and toxic stress and trauma are held in the body and not just in the mind, that sometimes words do not help? How do we know this in the background and know the science? But when it comes to practice, we can use this information and knowledge and transform it into a values-based approach, into an identity-informed approach, and into a trauma-informed approach, where we are not taking, this is the social graces framework that we are going to use, or this is what the nurturing care framework says, or this is what the science of polyvagal nerves and trauma says. But how do we look at the human in front of us and understand that they might be going through all of these, that all of these might be stored in their bodies, might be stored in their experiences, might be stored in how they express themselves. But we look beyond that. We look beyond the diagnosis. We take out this need to diagnose and label and work with them and trust that they are able to also take what they need, what they require, and what is most useful for them at this time. So while the trainers and everyone working with these children, those have a type of background, whether ECD, social work, psychology, or any type of training that supports work with children and their families, the most important component of the training and of their work is this experience that centers this human in front of them at the core of what they're doing, and also removes the facilitator as the main lead or as the dependent, or like who they depend on. The facilitator becomes someone who accompanies the families and is with them so that they can help them build this connection. They can help them use tools such as storytelling or play or art or movement, use and learn breathwork and grounding and sensory activities to create these islands of safety that remain with the parents and the children, with the caregivers, whether they are their teachers, whether they are their grandparents, whether they are other adults who are taking care of them in the community. Because we do, and we are having, unfortunately, with the displacement, we are seeing a lot of children who are not anymore with their parents, whether because of separation or death. So there are a lot of adult caregivers taking care of them. And the most important success factor here is how these children and how these facilitators, whatever their background is, are able to express themselves, find safety, are able to have consistent relationship, and if the caregivers with them are feeling confident enough in supporting them. This is how we know that the training really was successful.
Thank you, Grace. Now, if we move into the discussion that how well some strategies or some activities have worked well in supporting well-being during crisis, and what are like the promising practices or the activities which you can, from your context and your experience, list here as very effective, successful practices or activities. Thank you. Grace, you can continue and share the successful interventions or supporting activities which have worked in your context.
So one important part of this is understanding that a crisis is ever changing, it's dynamic, and it's unpredictable. So any program that we do design and any activity that we do design needs to also have this flexibility and adaptability, and needs to be easily shifted and switched to the needs. So whatever session is being led, and we're calling them session, but they might be very different structured. They might be one-on-one, they might be classroom-based, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to call them sessions. Whatever the session looks like, it needs to be very dynamic as well, and be able to scale up or scale down depending on the security context and the ecosystem that is happening. We need to move away from looking at people as numbers and look at the real impact and how that is like used. So facilitators are usually from these communities, and their reflections are very valid. We have seen in a lot of places how they move towards using, for example, digital connections like WhatsApp and other ways of communication to continue having this connection with these children, even when there's this disruption or there is this disconnection and there's this displacement where these children are losing the physical safe space that they have. So providing a digital or a virtual safe space for them. A lot of sensory exercises and activities are very important. And because this allows the children to really come back to themselves, to comfort. And children need that trust and that safety and that comfort. So grounding activities, we have a lot of activities that use sensory. And here is important to note how low resources is also very important. And the effectiveness also of natural materials like wood and sand and water and other textured items that can be used. We do not need to manufacture, we do not need to offer new things. We can use what exists there to provide these sensory activities, to allow these children to find this space and where they can shake their bodies, focus on some movement, because children need to grow, children need to develop, and physical development as important a component of mental health as mental health is as important of physical development. So allowing them and focusing activities on this physical development and body awareness and sensory grounding. Also collaborative activities and projects that feed the social development and also helps with strengthening the sense of belonging and identity when they are able to work together on something that they can call theirs, that they can feel that this is something they own and it is for them in a time where they have lost a lot of that security and a lot of their belongings. And music and rhythm, anything that focuses on rhythm, whether it uses music or it uses more natural things like clapping, drumming, or creating a lullaby or anything that is predictable, repetitive pattern that allows the body and the brain to relax, that allows the child to know what's coming next is very helpful. Also, a lot of activities that focus on storytelling and narrative play, where it allows children through different methods, whether they are acting out, where they are hearing a story and they are reflecting on the story with other peers or parents or teachers. It allows them this distance to be able to process emotions, talk about hard topics that they can reflect on and feel safe. And also sometimes controlling these outcomes is very helpful for them. And also coming back to nature and this exploration that happens in nature and finding this place where they can grow and have a sense of grounding and have a sense of safety and connection with the space around them really allows them to start the healing journey, because a healing journey cannot start if safety is not there. And while in crisis settings and in wars and emergencies, sometimes safety is not constant. Having and creating these small islands of safety, these small moments of safety and calm is very important to be able to learn and sustain any skills and begin any healing process.
Thank you, Grace. Munira, I'll come back to you and ask you that if you have faced any challenges in delivering quality support, like what are the challenges in the context where you have designed, implemented, researched on different interventions? Munira, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think I would build on what Grace shared so beautifully and so gracefully, that these interventions are meant to allow the child to be a child, to feel safe, feel loved, to feel cared, for a sense of belonging. This challenge, I think, and I'm thinking at the level of systems, not just individual programs, is that we don't measure if the child is feeling loved, the child is feeling he belongs, if the child feels they belong, or a sense of belonging, if they feel included, if they feel loved, if they're feeling taken care of. So a key challenge, the systems tend to prioritize what's easily measurable over what is developmentally foundational. Safety is developmentally foundational, but when we look at studies of early childhood, what we often try to demonstrate outcomes quickly is how are they developing in terms of their cognitive milestones or their language milestones or in their motor milestones. So it shifts focus to observable skills or learning gains rather than relational conditions that enable these developmental outcomes. And at the same time, I think, and this is also from evidence, that global programming tends to focus more on older children, and there's less attention to the early years, despite, I think, the most sensitive development, also, I think, the most sensitive in terms of presence of relational safety for these young children. So, in practice, I think it has created a gap. Relational processes are central to outcomes, but they remain largely invisible within measurement and accountability systems. So, what happens is what's not measured may not be prioritized. If you're not measuring them, we don't know if they're effective and if they need to scale up or if we need to advocate for them. So, I think for me, and this is also coming from my doctoral thesis, how does the measurement inform interventions? I think that's also an important aspect of programming for young children in crisis settings.
Thank you, Munira. That is a very important issue you have raised. And Grace, what is your take on those elements of MHPSS frontline delivery, which are usually underestimated or not paid enough attention by system level actors, the policymakers or the donors or funders? Like, what is the gap? What is missed out in this larger scenario or larger picture?
This is a great question, especially if you use the word frontliners and frontline, because one thing that is often ignored is the burden on the practitioner who is also a survivor. We look at local staff and expect them to deliver implementations and deliver results, while often their own mental health, their own grief, the displacement that they are working through, the separation that they are supposed and expected to, they're not supposed, they are expected to continue to deliver, even though they are separated from their families, even though they are losing people who they care about, even though they are also suffering from the economical crisis that is happening. We expect them, or they are expected to deal through all of that and work through all of that and deliver, while their own lived experiences, their own lived and vicarious trauma, and their own burnout is often ignored and is not allocated institutional resources that really support it. And on top of all of that, there is also this missing middle, that there's either this very unstructured approach to mental health, or there is the very clinical approach. And there is a vast gap between them, because we know that not everyone needs either or, and that the community, the healing is already a capacity that exists in community and has been done for centuries and generations. So this gap between them, especially in crisis zones, and the burden on these very few individuals who are able to provide any type of support is very big. And that leaves these local practitioners, whether they are specialists or they are doing non-specialized services, to manage a lot of complex dynamics and a lot of complex issues without a safety net, without referral, and without someone supporting this gap. And oftentimes, this is underlined by the pressure to deliver quick results that ignores these healing and regulation and relationship building measures that Munira was sharing about, that actually require time and consistency and require us to wait for that evidence to show up, because it takes time to do that. Or there's this loop of very short-term responses while trying to respond to a long-term problem. There is short-term investment of 12 months where they are not able to start responding. When they start responding, they actually have to start closing and moving, which also is kind of creating this unstable environment for the practitioners themselves and for the communities they are trying to serve and support, that makes it hard to work on prevention and sustainable social development and limits it to very immediate needs and responses that often get also ignored, because in most crises, the first response is for the basic needs. That is definitely very essential, but that creates a very huge gap.
Thank you, Grace. So, what makes the interventions sustainable, particularly in your context? And that would be the last part of our conversation so that we can take away some learnings on sustainability as well.
What can make it sustainable is coming back to one of the initial points we shared, is really leveraging the community, leveraging and knowing that sustainability does not and will not happen without the community being part of it. That the facilitators are exactly what the name is. They are facilitators. They facilitate things to happen. But the true resources and the true skills are already existing in the community and will continue to exist. So sustainability is about reclaiming the capacities communities already possess. It also means that certain systems, whether they are donors, whether they are coming from municipalities or from ministries, need to really look at things with the evidence that Munira shared, with the evidence from the facilitators that is very viable and very reliable, to be able to understand how the model and the rigid model needs to shift and how resources can be more leveraged. Because we do know that things can happen and with low resources, but the proper resources need to be allocated. And here we need to look at the human, at the financial, at the location, and at any other support materials, whether it is content, accessibility, and most importantly, the agency and the space to be able to share for the people who are putting these national strategies and systems, to listen to the people who are actually doing the work, and the people who are doing the work to listen to the people who are receiving this work. So these spaces that allow this open dialogue, this shared reflection, this communication are very important, because needs do differ. What works for one community, what works for one place will be different from somewhere else. But what is consistent and what should be consistent is really giving back this agency and this voice to the people who are doing the work.
Thank you, Grace. Munira, would you like to add anything to this conclusion or concluding remarks?
I would just add that I think when you talk about the large directors or the systems, I think they often underestimate. We talk about resources in terms of materials, right? In terms of what is tangible. But we often underestimate the level of emotional and relational investment that's required. And much of the systems are designed around the assumption that structured interventions can be delivered consistently, regardless of context, that can bring change. But however, in practice, they're deeply shaped by the relational environments in which these services are delivered, and which Grace has mentioned, of course, including the well-being and support of frontline workers themselves. So without having their supports in place, no matter how much money you put in, if the relational well-being and emotional well-being of the workers is not in place, you can't make an intervention work in itself. The healing has to happen, but it happens through the community, through shared feeling of loss and grief, and that has to be facilitated. But that requires an emotional investment. So there has to be an investment in our facilitators or our staff, whether it's their own mentoring, whether it's their own spaces. But I think they are also as important part of making this work as, of course, these children and these families.
Thank you very much, Munira. This brings us to the end of part 1 of this early evidence series. We have heard how mental health and psychosocial support in crisis contexts, often delivered through SEL-informed, community and school-based approaches, is shaped by community realities and constant adaptation. This is early evidence, emerging insights, not final answers, about what may help children and communities cope under pressure. In part 2, we will look at what happens when MHPSS is expected to move beyond projects and into systems and long-term responsibility. Early evidence is produced for Moving Mind Alliance by Lola Ayanda and edited by Mars FX Studios. I'm Jamila Razak. Thank you for listening.